Chapter 19, Alexander 16, April 4th, 45,784 BC. The Tuwalan woman and the giant watched the sunset together, followed by the emergence of the full glory of the second sun, visible even in midday, but distinctively bright at night. Lailan was coming to understand the world better and better all the time, and discovered that though there were questions Hemhut could not answer, most questions he thoroughly and absolutely could. She had asked him about Tuwala's fate before, but the sight of the second sun, a sun that had been in the sky since long before she was born, made her think of it again, and she had new questions for him. So again she asked him to tell her the tale. Hemhut and Lailan lay in a field of flowers. Lailan, the red flower in the middle of her wreath off-center on her forehead, lay on top of him. Both were looking at the dimming sky, watching the bane of Tuwala show its face, and she said to him, "My love, tell me again what happened to Tuwala." "Where would you like for me to begin?" he asked, hands cradled behind his head, feeling her breathing through his chest. She rolled over and lay on her belly and scooted up to just under his chin and looked him in the eye, resting her chin in a cradle of her hands, and said, "From the beginning." "All the way from the beginning?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Everything important, everything that ever involved you." "Very well, my love," he said. "When I first sensed the early simple life forms on Tuwala, I desired to come and visit them. I wasn't myself. I wasn't thinking in any normal way. I was operating without the use of my memory. I was just a being, an entity. At that point, I simply was, and when I saw that there was something else, I wanted to move toward it, so I did. I remember being surprised by the fact that I was not already there. It was shocking for me to discover that my being was centered within a fixed mass at a fixed point in space-time, and that I was not in fact everywhere and could not be distinctively anywhere of my choosing at once. Yet, the assumption had no basis for comparison, the thought had no precedence, so it did not register as anything so catastrophic to my psyche as one might think it should have. It was received more as a definite, a limitation of that which I simply was not formerly aware, but was a fact, and should be regarded as a fact. The newly discovered knowledge that I had a body was not what was traumatic for me anyway. It was the notion that I was not everything that alarmed me. I didn't think of my knowledge of being restricted to a body as significant because it meant that I had a body. The fact that I had a body and the implications were paled by acknowledgement of the truth that I was not in fact the universe itself. Because up until that point, I thought that I was truly everything everywhere all at once. I believed that I was the universe itself. Afterward, I could still observe the events of time unfolding everywhere, just as my vision of it had been before I had first moved and discovered the presence of my body. My perspective did not differ from what it had been moments before. My experience of the universe, having formerly believed that I was the universe itself, did not change drastically when I learned that I had a body, and that I was somehow inexplicably encapsulated. For it still felt to me as if I was the entire universe, and was just physically manipulating a chosen mass within it. The notion of a concrete identity was still far from my thoughts. I was everything and also one thing, but that was all that I knew. "That's freaking deep, Hemhut. Go on," she said. He'd never revealed that part of the story to her before. That was another wonderful thing about having Hemhut as your lover. He would never explain the same thing the same way twice, and if he did, he would go deeper, reveal more of the intricate subtleties of reality, so deep sometimes that it made Lailan begin to ponder, as he did, whether or not existence was truly happening. She loved talking to him, and he loved talking to her. They were a perfect love, made for one another. One of them, quite literally. As I said, I was not a thinking, cognitive mind at this point, he said. And yet, just as someone with amnesia retains certain fundamental memories, I envisioned the future creatures of Tuwala, and I, from a distance, hurtling toward Tuwala through intergalactic space, began to manipulate the early footsteps in the evolution of life here, to make it more like that with which my subconscious was familiar, and very different from the path nature had set in place. Life on Tuwala is completely different than what it would have been without my direct involvement. If I hadn't aimed my thoughts and inflicted my will upon it from a distance, there would never have been advanced life here. The bacterium that mutated and initiated photosynthesis would have never evolved and bore progeny, filling the atmosphere with oxygen. The life here would have remained anaerobic, as most life is throughout the cosmos, and would never have made effective use of heavier elements as sources of power in their life cycles as they now use oxygen. If I had not forced it to become more like my home world, even the most advanced life forms here would be today indistinguishable to the unaided eye from the mud and slime. "That's amazing, my love," she said. "So you guided the evolution of life on our planet?" "I did, up until a point," he said. "Once I'd advanced them so far along, after aiding in their constant competition with one another by intentionally mutating their offspring and then allowing nature, most of the time, to then decide which bloodlines would spawn and which would not, thereby ensuring the passage of the most beneficial mutations to their offspring by way of their genetic material, once the consequences of my actions became apparent, I saw the error of my ways and how my involvement was detrimental in so many ways, and I eased up. Evolution normally happens through a process of natural selection. I fed them evolutionary changes, forced it onto the offspring of this world's early inhabitants, and then allowed for the environmental demands and the dynamic with other existing creatures in their environment to shape them the rest of the way, under the guise of natural selection. Only it wasn't. There were times when I would even actively intervene on behalf of individual creatures, those who I took pity on and favored over others. So the evolution of Tuala's creatures was very much through a process of artificial selection, like that normally done in a laboratory or through selective breeding, only to all of nature on a global scale. That became a problem. When I actively intervened on behalf of a creature, an individual, it inevitably resulted in an equitable amount of suffering as to that which I had averted being wrought upon another, if not the same creature later in time. I soon after discovered that the same was true of entire species. When the effects of my prejudice shifted the balance in the food chain sufficiently to cause a global mass extinction event, I began to realize the error of my ways. This was still well before life had ever set foot on land, shortly after the evolution of the earliest vertebrates. When I realized that it was my foolishness that had nearly ended all life here, I stopped interfering, and I simply observed for the most part. That is, until you came along and drew me from the mountainside. "Why did you come out of the mountain to help me?" she asked, wondering to herself why she had never thought to ask him before. "Because I recognized you, Lylon," he said. "I was everything, and all new things were to me new, always had been, all but you. You are as old as I am, because you have always been my destined love, and I have always loved you. I think that perhaps my entire purpose in sculpting life on Tuala may all along have been to bring you to life, my dream made flesh and blood." She paused, not accustomed to romantic talk from her giant, for what he'd said was highly romantic, despite the clinical way in which he'd said it, and she took in what he'd said. Stricken even after thorough dissection of his unusual conveyance, she shook her head and teased, "Wow, you sure know how to sweet-talk a girl, Hemhet." "You know that my every word is true," he said. "But that's not what you really wanted to know. You want to know what is destroying Tuala, and how I've ushered in its inevitable fate." The romantic moment had gone, but she was still fully bemused by her smitten love, and nodded her head. "Yes, and I have a question," and she pointed to the second sun. "If the second sun is going to implode and become a supernova, why does it look like it's getting bigger?" "It is not the second sun that is the greatest threat. It is the unseen third that is the problem. The third sun will be the one which goes supernova," he said. "Tuala's sun is part of a trinary star system, one of 3 stars in orbit around a mutual center of gravity. Until a few 100,000 years ago, the star system consisted of the yellow dwarf star we call our sun, a red giant, which is a star late in its life sequence that has exhausted its hydrogen fuel and begun fusing helium, causing the temperature to drastically rise and expand the width of the star by a large magnitude, in the case of our system, to over 100 times its original size. And then, crucially, there was a dead star, a white dwarf. the remnants of a star that had long ago fused all of its lighter elements and become an inactive crystal star. "That sounds nice," she said. "Is the star really made of crystal at that point?" "Yes, my love," he said. "White dwarfs are crystalline in structure and extremely dense and massive. They are essentially giant floating gemstones, but you would not want to get too close. White dwarfs are the remnants of the cores of dead stars, stars that have fused all of their lighter elements, and that for which nuclear fusion has ceased. Many remain massive enough to keep planets from their solar system in orbit. They are small in comparison to their original size, but they still create a significant gravity well in their vicinity, on an order of magnitude comparable to that which was created in the presence of the star in its original state. This would be what our Sun, currently a mid-sequence yellow dwarf star, will have become in the end, just like the star of my homeworld. Given a few billion years, our Sun would have become a red giant and started blowing off its outer layers, ejecting them out into space, reducing its overall mass, and then rapidly burning through its fuel of lighter elements, the hydrogen, the helium, and so on, until the state of core collapse becomes so intense that the weight of gravity starts forcing heavier elements to fuse. But there is not enough mass to collapse it infinitely and create a singularity, and it would have eventually become a white dwarf. Remember, nuclear fusion and the resulting energy from the forced merger of atoms is what enables stars to fight gravity off and keep from collapsing under their own weight. As gravity increases the rate of accretion of available mass, and the accretion of mass increases gravity, more frequent nuclear fusion results in the core because of the increased pressure, the increased weight. This is why large stars live fast and die young, because they are so massive that their lighter elements have to burn rapidly in order to combat the force of gravity because they are being crushed by such immense weight. And small ones live seemingly forever, because their rate of nuclear fusion need not be so great. Then, naturally, light emerges. The nuclear reaction, the formation of heavier elements from lighter ones, emits an energetic byproduct, the results of the conversion of mass into energy, and the energy is released as photons, light waves, and heat, all the measures of light. The heat forces expansion of the core, and the shed light makes the random walk from the core to the surface of the star, being absorbed and expelled, bouncing from atom to atom in the overcrowded core, less so in the subsequent layers of the star, for varying lengths of time, until it finally surfaces and escapes out into the cosmos. Now, what do you suppose would happen if a red giant expanded into the vicinity of the gravitational field of a neighboring white dwarf? Remember the disparity in mass and density involved. "The red giant will..." She gave it a moment's thought, then said, "expand into the white dwarf, and the white dwarf's gravity will start attracting the gases from the outer layers of the red giant. Is that what's happening?" "That is what started happening a long time ago, my love," he said. "The process has reignited fusion in the core of the white dwarf. It has accreted so much mass from the expanding giant that the added weight became sufficient to start fusing lighter elements around the core, and the core itself has started once again retracting, becoming more dense, and fusing elements that do not supply an outward push, elements that take more energy to manufacture than is given off as a byproduct of their manufacturing process, signaling the beginning of the end. The inevitable death of the red giant had been temporarily postponed, but fate had bred a monster in having done so. In a few thousand years, the reinvigorated white dwarf star will again begin to very actively feed on its slowly expanding sister star, the red giant which we refer to as the second sun, and it will explode. The area of space we occupy will be known to the people of my home world as the Crab Nebula, a giant gas cloud that results from this inevitable supernova. Nothing will survive on Tawala. And, to answer your question, my love, one reason it looks like it's getting bigger is because it is getting a little bigger due to natural processes, not fast enough to be perceptible from day to day, however. Truly, it is the fact that we are moving toward it that has caused it to appear bigger and bigger over the passing generations of Tawalans. So, it is not that the star which we call the second sun will inevitably go supernova, it is the third. What we call the second sun is the red giant which is destined to feed the coming apocalypse. All the while, Our star is moving closer to the future cataclysm along the trajectory of its natural orbit. The whole thing is a recipe for disaster. And the reason that Tuwala lost the use of electricity and began to lose atmosphere was because of this event? The renewed expansion of this red giant star? She asked. Yes, in combination with a very ill-timed shifting of Tuwala's magnetic poles, he said. So, when particles being flung out from our chaotic neighboring stars, not to mention our own, made contact with the atmosphere by way of what are essentially massive solar flares, the energy was not deflected to the poles as it otherwise would have been, and the whole of Tuwala became inundated with charged particles. This not only further weakened the magnetic field, already in disarray due to the pole shift, but the weakened field also meant that more layers of the upper atmosphere would be blown off of the planet, like dust from a shelf, as they were slammed with waves of particles. This is why life expectancy became so short for the surviving species here. Cosmic rays mutate DNA, causing cancerous tumors to grow if the mutated cells go through mitosis unabated and are able to reproduce. Lack of protection by an organized magnetic field coinciding with frequent coronal mass ejections from a neighboring star also spells certain doom for any civilization heavily reliant on electricity. The continuous loss of atmosphere only makes the effects more prevalent and concentrated, and a prevalence of charged particles in the lower atmosphere means not only a prevalence of cancer in susceptible life forms, but also frequent electrical disturbances. The reason that Tuwala lost the use of electricity, which they had relied on for so many generations, was due directly to the abundance of charged particles in the atmosphere. Any active electrical device that gets hit by a pocket of charged particles will harness the charged electrons directly from the atmosphere, funnel them into the power supply of the device, and the device will overload, most often rendering it permanently inoperable due to damaged circuitry. This knowledge was weaponized by scientists of my homeworld and was commonly referred to as an electromagnetic pulse. When it became apparent that no electrical device was going to be of prolonged use to anyone anymore, it was the end of a lavish era. Tuwala reverted back to how it was prior to the development of even simple technology, and the hardships of life without the aid of electrical devices proved detrimental to the people. The population of Tuwalans was cut in half over the following decade, and then halved again within the next 5 years. Much cannibalism ensued during this era, and Tuwalans lived in fear of one another. Once the population dwindled to such a number that it could be sustained easily by the plenty of Tuwala, balance was again established. This was long before you were born, my love. Luckily, you didn't have to witness the cataclysm that practically ended Tuwalan society. It was a time of true terror for every living creature of this world. The sky, as it was at the time of your birth, was much more forgiving, the people much more sane. Then, when you came out of the mountain and you stopped the rain and wind and fixed the sky and did everything you did that at the expense of Tuwala itself? She remembered him having alluded to it the last time she'd asked. Unfortunately, yes, he said. Had I not reflexively done what I'd done, it would have been safe here for tens of thousands of more years, almost up until the time of the coming supernova event. We could have developed shielding to protect the people from the cosmic rays, instituted escape procedures not so extreme as that which I devised. But I instead unwittingly hastened the death of Tuwala by draining it of its surplus of resources without consideration for the future. I saw that it needed more gases, so I pulled them from where they were held in reserve, embedded in Tuwala's waters and mountains and valleys, upsetting the cycle, the balance of the storage and release of gases by Tuwala itself. Tuwala, like many planets, was breathing, and I stole the breath from its lungs. To create the brief 5 years of perfection we experienced, I sacrificed age upon age of Tuwala's forthcoming lifeblood. I ushered in this premature death, trying to save the world. Had I not the clarity of mind that I now have, I would still be looking for a way to save it, still unaware that it was I who accelerated the loss of atmosphere, and oblivious to the fact that it is invariably doomed regardless of my actions. Well, I'm glad you did what you did, she said, reassuring him. The Tuwalans are safe with the amalgamator, and as you said, they will thrive in the future. Tuwala was doomed anyway. You made it paradise for everyone. You saved Tuwala. Then, when you saw that it was in danger, you saved it again. You are a hero, Hemhut. Don't ever think of yourself as any less than what you are. I am so happy that I am here with you, and I love you so much. You have nothing to feel guilty for. You are the best thing to ever happen to this world and to me." "Thank you," he said. "I love you, Lylon." "I love you, Hemhut," she said, and she slid up and kissed him on the cheek. The last light of dusk was creeping along the horizon, revealing ever more the brightness of the second sun, a foreboding sight, but it did not spoil the sunset for the lovers. Everything was exactly as it should be. Hemhut basked in the delight of knowing her, loving her, serving and pleasing her, and she lived as a queen bereft of a kingdom. Her only woe, which she would never reveal to Hemhut, was that they could never have children together, and over time a part of her regretted having decided to stay behind. For though her love was able to create for her nearly anything that she desired, he could not manifest another Tawalin for her to talk to, and though she was never alone, her giant always at her beck and call, it became a lonesome life for Lylon in the end. Counter to her, apart from that which would forever torment his soul, Hemhut was truly content, and very happy to be alone with his love, because unlike her, he was not alone. Daniel Dwyer 15, November 3rd, 2050 AD. The introduction of Hanadan into Daniel Dwyer's life resulted in some changes to his routine. During procedures that which had been fluid, she interjected more frequent use of the divination tool, arguing that people could be in danger during a time when he is preoccupied by some unnecessarily long part of his routine, such as during his morning workout, and that the prolonged intervals between staring into his 8-ball could be costing lives. She cited the instances when he had saved people from falling. They had all occurred in the night during Daniel's sleep time, and she suggested that perhaps the only reason he had never been recorded rescuing someone from falling during daylight hours could have been in part due to Daniel not checking his 8-ball more frequently during his waking time, particularly when subdued by one preoccupation or another, working out, doing chores, preparing food, or whatever the case may be. The doctor consented and allowed her to modify his routines within reason as she saw fit to allow for more frequent use of the 8-ball. In the nearly 6 years since she had moved in and incorporated this into his routine, it had never bore fruit. Daniel had not once in all that time used any of the breaks in his routine to put himself to sleep. That changed the morning of the 3rd of November 2050, when, while in the middle of vacuuming the living room, he looked into his 8-ball, let go of the still-running vacuum, laid on the floor, and went to sleep. Hannah had been preparing their breakfast at the time. The boys ate much cleaner, healthier food thanks to Hannah, and despite some early begrudging on the part of Dr. Foster, he could not deny the health benefits of their new diet or the satisfaction of knowing that their food was ecologically friendly and humanely sourced. It cost a little more, but it was worth it. The doctor said that he was actually starting to feel younger once he'd gotten over his initial disdain, and he relatively quickly adjusted to their new way of life, the two of them incessantly being mothered by Hannah. He looked better too, younger. She had limited his intake of meat, once a corner staple in his diet, and after he'd started to make the connection between feeling crappy and having eaten meat, he began to insist upon it less and less, and would now only crave a steak every here and there, a craving he would seldom satisfy because of the knowledge of how he would feel afterward, and thus she converted them to a vegetarian diet and made the doctor think that it was, in part at least, his idea. She was a formidable woman with a keen intellect, and was still ravishing in her early 70s, an ageless, timeless beauty. This life was a far cry from that which she'd envisioned when she'd first rang the doctor's doorbell, but it was her life, for better or worse, and she made it the best she could. Despite his lack of reciprocation or even acknowledgement of her on a normal human level, she remained completely devoted to Daniel. She still considered herself married to him in her heart, and she abided by the principles she considered to be wifely. Just as she would not have abandoned him if he were once able-bodied only to later become disabled, she would not abandon him now upon learning of his disability. She, in her delusion, did not consider it a love of no requite, and she genuinely believed that if he were capable of expressing that he truthfully reciprocated her affections, he would, and he would say that he loved her, and that he absolutely favored her over the world at large. She did not fear him one iota. Her mind was too far gone to fathom reason, too stubbornly decided to be open to the notion that she was wrong. This would cost her everything in the end. She loved and trusted something that did neither value her life or her love in the slightest. She knew it, she just refused to believe it, much more content to live in her fantasy world than to face the cold reality that Daniel Dwyer was not capable of loving her. That knowledge would have broken her. She'd finished making breakfast, and it wasn't until after she'd turned off the burner that she realized Daniel was not in his seat awaiting his breakfast as he should be. She then became cognizant of the running vacuum in the next room and went to investigate. There he was, asleep on the floor in a fetal position, curled around his 8-ball. Hannah switched off the vacuum and smiled at Daniel, and a tear left her eye. He was no doubt on his way to save someone, she thought, someone who might not have been saved if he had set down his 8-ball before beginning his household chores. Dr. Foster was at work at the asylum. The camera saw everything, however, and even though no reports of a sighting ever surfaced that corroborated with the day sleep event of that morning, Hannah felt very happy with herself, having seen what she believed to be all of her efforts to restructure his routines finally appear to reap some reward. Only in this instance, he did not save anyone. In this instance, he took a truly innocent life. When Nathaniel Reddington learned that he could summon and manipulate the spirit of Daniel Dwyer, he set straightaway attempting to master controlling him, and then used him to acquire the ill-gotten gains that would comprise the foundation of his fortune. In the beginning, he would summon Daniel, whose name was then unknown to him, and most often use him to rob drug dealers, pimps, and thugs, the kind of people who don't call the police when they get robbed. Not that Nathaniel ever allowed Daniel to ever leave anyone behind to call the police. Authorities believed for a time that they were dealing with a string of organized murders and thefts by rival gangs or drug lords, but the big hole in their theory was that in cases involving the murder of drug dealers, the drugs were seldom missing, just the money. The consistent evidence implicating the use of blunt objects as the murder weapon and the lack of residue from said weapon or evidence of the identity of the perpetrator left on the scene eventually led to the merger of these cases with others believed to have been perpetrated by the spirit. The signs were there. The spirit was implicated, but it was inconsistent with his modus operandi. No witnesses of these events ever survived to report that the incarnation of the spirit that had come to kill and rob them had borne a glowing red right arm which ended in a glowing red ball, very distinctively in place of his hand. They were all beaten to death with it before they would have the chance. Nathaniel was still young and naive enough to give Daniel standing orders without thinking through the potential consequences, the way he had done so 4 years earlier when he'd had a vault installed in their estate. After the construction of the massive safe was completed, Nathaniel thought that it might be wise to add an additional security measure. He'd realized through experimentation the potential for the spirit to follow instruction, and that those instructions could be imposed upon potential stimuli. For example, he once summoned the spirit and said, "Spirit, if I ever walk out of this bathroom with the water running, turn the water tap off for me," and it would comply. Sometimes, often depending on the time of day, it would be several minutes before he would appear and turn off the water, and sometimes he would appear practically instantaneously and turn it off. Other times it would take hours. But Nathaniel wasn't thinking clearly when he gave Daniel his standing orders to guard the safe. As often happens in the guarding of treasures, his thoughts were mired by greed and fear of loss or discovery. So, he perhaps did not fully think through the command he had given his very real imaginary friend when he told him to guard the safe. Because he'd said, "If anyone other than my wife or I ever touch this safe with the intent to see inside of it without either my consent or her consent, open that window," and he'd pointed at a window perpendicular to the safe-bearing wall. "Take them out of that window, take them somewhere no one will hear them or ever find them. Hurt them repeatedly so that they suffer and beg for mercy for at least an hour. Then kill them in a slow, excruciating way. Make sure at least one of their limbs is snapped off and shoved up their ass while they're still alive. Then, once they're dead, bury the body somewhere that no one is likely to ever find it." Those were his exact words. He didn't realize at the time that his little joy, the love of his life, his sweet, loving daughter Aurelia Reddington, would one day become curious about it. She couldn't do much at the time when he'd given Daniel the command. She was still just a baby at the time, and he hadn't taken her growth and potential forthcoming explorations into consideration much at the time, and he never thought to revise the command to ensure for his daughter's safety. No one had ever tried to break into the safe, and Nathaniel had put the standing order he'd given out of his mind. So, when the fateful day that little 4.5-year-old, beautiful, wonderful, innocent Aurelia decided playfully to try her luck at the combination to the safe, and pulled to no avail on the handle, she did so unknowingly preparing to unleash the fullness of her father's truer nature upon herself, and she would die an agonizing, horrible death at the command of her wicked father, as Daniel followed his instructions to the T, exploring new ways of inflicting pain upon her with no reverence for her innocence, an unfeeling disregard for her desperate pleas and blood-curdling wails of intense pain as he dismembered, contorted, snapped, sliced, and penetrated her with the natural focus of a prodigious tormentor for over 3 hours, knowing exactly how to escalate her level of pain throughout the experience, and doing so expertly. She prayed for death within the first minute, but her prayers would go unanswered for hours, until she could not only no longer pray, but could no longer form any thought beyond those of her primal animal self. In her last moments, before finally slipping into shock and dying, she was without a doubt experiencing more severe pain than any single human being in all of history had ever been subjected to, and by an immeasurable degree of magnitude. Little 4-year-old Aurelia suffered more than anyone before her ever had, the proud daughter of a lethal egomaniac, suffering and dying for the hate in her father's heart. Around 2 hours into the torture session, he selected her left arm for the job. The spirit pinned the mutilated innocent girl to the ground by her left shoulder, and then slammed the ball that was its glowing red hand down to crush her left bicep and humerus. Then he tore the arm off like perforated paper and proceeded to insert it into her anus until the elbow of her dismembered arm disappeared into her rectum and beyond, staring her right in the eyes as he shoved it deeper and deeper inside of her, watching himself through her eyes. She was already experiencing such a catastrophic level of pain that it didn't get the full reaction it would have otherwise warranted, and was met instead with a defeated, gurgling moan, and not a full-fledged scream of terror. After the disappearance of his daughter, Nathaniel would never think of his metaphysical friend the same way again, but it wouldn't stop him from putting the spirit to further use. Nathaniel had always gotten his nunu, and thus had lived with no regrets. The loss of his daughter was his one and only. Yet, even when he'd figured out what had happened to her, he did not shed a tear for her. He would not blame himself, and tears would be condemning. As he watched the surveillance footage of the spirit carrying her out of the open window, its hand clasped around her throat as she flailed in pain and fear, that familiar, knowing yet unfeeling look crept its way onto his face. Then he picked up the phone, calling the police, and very calmly reported her missing. He told them that she was probably hiding, maybe even asleep in some obscure corner of the estate, but requested that they come anyway because he hadn't seen her for several hours. By the time Daniel woke up, his breakfast was stone cold, so Hannah prepared it for him again, and he sat at the table, doing nothing except for looking into his 8-ball every few seconds, awaiting his meal. Whether or not he was consciously aware of what was happening in or out of his body was debatable, though it would be a reasonable assumption that he had no thoughts of his own, demonstrated by his waking actions. There was one piece of evidence to support that he did in fact have control over his actions, the events surrounding his death. For just prior to his death, it became very clear that he could decide for himself what it was that he wanted to do without the medium of the 8-ball and act upon it when properly motivated. Why he did not stop himself from torturing and murdering little Aurelia was perhaps indicative of the power of influence Nathaniel Reddington, Mr. Red, held over him. Then again, it was exactly this influence he had been witnessed overcoming in the end. So, maybe it was in truth more an indication of his subconscious desire to instill fear, inflict pain, and kill that let him do it. For Hannah and the rest of the society, they had it all wrong. Daniel was not an angel intent on saving good people. He was a demon intent on punishing the wicked. They were idolizing the worst type of being. Yet, were it not for the idolatry of him, the future would have looked very different. For it was from Hannah that Daniel would learn of his identity, and she saw him as a benevolent, loving, and kind God. Luckily for the people of Earth, He would eventually try to live up to that expectation in her memory.